Is the Nvidia RTX 5050 worth buying in late 2025 or early 2026? Let's find out. All right, jumping into Assassin's Creed Shadows at 1080p ultra low, just to give you guys a baseline here of where we're sitting at such a low setting with no ray tracing on, and we're just mid 60s on the averages. Does not look good at these settings. I would not want to be playing on these settings. You know, mind you, the 70 FPS is nice for a single player game, but on ultra low, not doing too hot right now, guys. Most of you guys probably aren't going to want to be playing on ultra low settings, but just to give you guys an idea, with DLSS quality, you'll be sitting at 89 FPS with 77 FPS on the 1% lows. And if you turn on frame generation on top of DLSS quality, you'll be sitting at 122 FPS with 109 on the 1% lows. Moving on to 1080p ultra high, the highest preset in Assassin's Creed Shadows. Immediately you guys can see the game looks so much better. As you guys can see on the screen, the native resolution is at 34 FPS on average for the run and 28 FPS on the 1% lows. And for DLSS quality preset, we're looking at 39 FPS with 33 on the 1% lows. And then turning on frame generation, we get 59 FPS and 50 for the 1% lows. Okay, Borderlands 4 is up next, and if you guys know anything about Borderlands 4, it's that it is not optimized very well at all. It performs pretty poorly on most graphics cards, which is a shame because it's a pretty fun game. So at 1080p low is what we're sitting at right now, at about 44 FPS on native resolution, which obviously is not ideal. Now, mind you, this is an extremely combat heavy area. I really wanted to find an area on the map where there's a lot of action going on to give you guys a fair shake at kind of the worst case scenario in this game. We are sitting at 45 FPS for the final run with 37.1% lows, and DLSS gets us up to 71, surprisingly, with 55 on the 1% lows, and adding frame generation on top of that gets us to 108 with 87 on the 1% lows. Okay, so I just switched from 1080p low to 1080p high, and we were barely getting 30 FPS, and we weren't even in combat yet. So I turned on DLSS quality real quick, and that brings us up to mid 40s, maybe into the 50s. Frame Gen X2 gets us up even further, 80, 85 maybe, but again, we're not in combat yet. On this next clip, I have 1440p on low settings. I figure, hey, we can run low settings on the game. The VRAM's surprisingly barely hanging on even on low. So at 1440p native, as you guys can see on the bars on the screen, we have 27 FPS on the averages with 15 the 1% lows. I will preface the rest of this video saying that this is the worst performing game on our list so far. But as you guys can see, if you throw some DLSS on there, we get just under 50 FPS with just under 40 for the 1% lows. And then adding Frame Gen X2, we'll get 75. So 62 on the 1% lows. Honestly, guys, frame gen isn't that bad on this game. It's not a competitive shooter. I actually found myself using it most of the time, and I had a good time. All right, next up, we got the Call of Duty killer. We got Battlefield 6, 1080p, low settings. Again, giving you guys that baseline about, the maximum FPS we can achieve if you guys are more competitive players. Baseline, we're looking at 118 FPS with 103 on the 1% lows at native resolution. And throwing DLSS on there, we're getting 126 with 106 1% lows, and frame generation ×2 boosts us up to 184 with 162 on 1% lows. So pretty good run overall. And then we switch to the overkill preset, where it's not such a good performance. So as you guys can imagine, low, overkill, somewhere in between there if you guys want, to fiddle with your settings. But just to give you guys that range, we're sitting at 59 FPS on the averages with 50 on the 1% lows for native. And then DLSS quality is going to take us to 61 FPS and 50 on the 1% lows. DLSS doesn't do a whole lot in Battlefield 6 at 1080p. But if you add some frame generation on top of that, we're looking at 105 FPS, 94 on the 1% lows. But 1440p is a different story. And you guys are going to see that here in a second. And we are sitting just at around 75 FPS. But let's pull up the chart and let's see what we got overall. So it looks like 78 FPS after the whole run here, just kind of running around, shooting some people, and 65 on 1% lows for 1440p native resolution at the low preset. If you throw on some DLSS quality on top of that, it looks like we're sitting at 86 FPS. So again, getting a little more of a bump than we were at 1080p with 76 on the 1% lows. And then if you throw on some frame generation on top of that, times 2, we're getting 117 FPS with 99 on the 1% lows. Hopping into our next big title this year, we're looking at Arc Raiders, and we're testing at 1080p low settings, native resolution, and for the final run, we get 165 FPS. On the averages and 143 on the 1% lows. Really great experience, guys. Arc Raiders runs phenomenally on the RTX 5050. You guys will not be disappointed with the RTX 5050 if Arc Raiders is your main game. The game runs so well. We're actually sitting at 188 FPS if you turn on some DLSS quality, and 168 on the 1% lows for that. And then if you turn on frame gen times 2, you are looking at 228 FPS, guys, and 211 FPS on the 1% lows, which works great in this game, given that it's not a lot of fast-paced movement. Now, as you guys can see, I just switched to 1080p epic settings, the highest in the game, and we're sitting at 78 FPS and 65 on the 1% lows. If you throw on some DLSS at 1080p Ultra, you're sitting at 93 FPS with 76 on the 1% lows, and frame generation times 2 is going to get you up to 144 FPS with 125 on the 1% lows. So really very, very good experience. Turning on frame generation, I still found my aim to be very good. I didn't feel a whole lot of input lag added from the frame generation, which works great. Loved it. Everyone's favorite battle royale, Fortnite. I have not played this game in quite some time, but hey, popped in. There's a lot of bots to kill, and we were sitting at a very buttery smooth 287 FPS on the averages and 143 on the 1% lows at 1080p low settings. DX12, by the way. We do have high resolution textures downloaded. I know a lot of people turn those off. As you can see, some performance benefits from having those disabled, but I have them installed on the computer. And then if I turn on DLSS quality on 1080p, the FPS actually goes down, guys. So this is an interesting phenomenon. I guess it has something to do with DLSS and its draw calls and CPU, usage, and just how it taxes the engine at a lower resolution like 1080p. So with Fortnite, we're actually seeing 211 FPS with DLSS, 162 on the 1% lows. So the 1% lows improved, but our average FPS actually decreased. And Fortnite at 1080p epic. Forgive me for ratting, guys. The FPS was rough. It was rough playing Fortnite at 48 FPS. It was doable, and the game looked really good, but yeah, at just around 50 FPS for the averages and 18 for the 1% lows. Yeah, we were struggling. DLSS did come in clutch though. It brought us up to 75 FPS with DLSS quality at 1080p Ultra, which it was actually a pretty fun time, guys. Like, I still was able to be really competitive. I think by the end of this game, I had about 20 kills. So 75 FPS on the averages, 56 on the 1% lows. One of the RTX 50 series biggest features from Nvidia is multi-frame generation. Is it worth buying a brand new graphics card for? I'd say no. However, I'll let you guys decide when you see the numbers. They're fake frames, but it does make the game a lot smoother, visually speaking, and I turn it on for a lot of games. Not for a lot of competitive games, but for a lot of single player games, Borderlands, Even Arc Raiders, slower paced multiplayer games, it works great. To give you guys an idea of just how much performance you can see with frame generation enabled, we hopped into Battlefield 6 at 1080p Ultra. At 1080p Ultra with DLSS quality on, we saw 61 FPS on average with 50 on 1% lows. But when we turned frame generation ×2 on, we saw 105 FPS with 94 1% lows. Frame gen ×3 takes that even further to 153 FPS with 138 on the 1% lows. And when you turn frame gen ×4 on, we're seeing a whopping 190 FPS with 168 on the 1% lows. Now, obviously, that's something you guys might not want to use in a multiplayer game where input latency is pivotal to winning the game. But in a single player game, to increase fluidity and just to make the game feel a lot smoother, and especially if you're playing on a TV with a controller, you hardly notice a difference. Even in Battlefield or Marvel Rivals, especially Arc Raiders, where we're running a very high base frame rate to begin with, just giving those extra frames, it felt great. And I was still able to play very competitively, win a lot of games, get a lot of kills. So the frame generation feature actually is pretty great in my opinion. All right, the RTX 5050's final test of the day. Can it handle ray tracing? So we loaded up, of course, Cyberpunk 2077. I get it's an older game, but it's a perfect example for ray tracing because we can just flip the switch, turn ray tracing on versus off, and really push this thing. So at 1080p ultra settings, ray tracing off with DLSS quality enabled, we're sitting at 93 FPS on the averages with 73 on the 1% lows. But when we turn ray tracing on at 1080p Ultra, ray tracing on, DLSS quality, we're sitting at 55 FPS on average with 46 on the 1% lows. And further, if we want to turn frame generation on, as you guys can see, that bumps us up to 92 FPS on average with 78 on the 1% lows. Great experience in a single player game. Mind you, again, 1080p, not everyone's choice of resolution, but very playable frame rates with ray tracing on. Testing done. Let's answer the question. Is the RTX 5050 worth buying moving into 2026? I'd say it depends. Competitive multiplayer games on low settings, it performs fantastically, able to be very competitive, able to have a great time. The single player games, on the other hand, where you want to be immersed and run those higher textures, it was struggling in certain newer titles. So it might be something worth pausing over. But if you're willing to take the settings down a couple notches, you're still gonna have a fun time. Would I recommend it? So if you guys are willing to make some compromises at $250, I think it's a great way to get into PC gaming or to upgrade a GTX 1060, 2060, you know, some older cards like that. I think you guys will be happy with your purchase. So if you guys found this video helpful, informative, or just straight up entertaining, hit that like button. It helps the channel out a lot. Subscribe if you feel like watching more content like this, and leave a comment. I'm curious what you guys think of the RTX 5050. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. Anyways, have a great rest of your day. Peace.